Well, sir, good evening. My name is Theodore Schultz, Theodore Augustus Schultz, and the folks around town always called me Gus. I was born in 1839, and unfortunately, 23 years later, I died of tuberculosis in 1862. Now, some may feel it's a little bit strange that I can be here talking to you tonight, but it's not really so strange because the truth is, I never left Schultzville. You see this portrait up here? Shortly after my death, my Masonic brothers had this full-size, 7-foot-tall painting portrait made of me, and they hung it in the Masonic Hall next door on the second floor behind the master's chair. And I've been up there ever since, looking down at the goings-on in the meetings for over 150 years, and pretty much keeping up to speed as to what's going on around town, what's changed and what hasn't changed. And quite frankly, a lot in Schultzville has not changed in 150 years. But time was going on, and after 150 years of never being cleaned, my frame was getting kind of shaky, my canvas was getting pretty loose, and my colors with no cleaning were getting pretty dull. And to be honest with you, I was feeling kind of tired and down, and don't you know, I was feeling a little bit neglected. But then just 2 years ago, those good folks at the Clinton Historical Society restored my painting. They cleaned me thoroughly, they strengthened my frame, my canvas is nice and tight, and I'm just feeling full of life, full of new life. And I'm really happy to be here tonight to talk to you. By the way, well, thank you. By the way, Mr. Marshall and I are really pleased to see such a nice turnout. And last November, we had 90 people come to this turnout. So there must be a lot of interest in the history of Schultzville. Don't you know, sometimes I think that I might write a book about the history of Schultzville. Now, don't you know, would that make me a ghost writer? Please give me a moment. Well, sir, don't you know the history of Schultzville starts with this ledger in 1797, which notes that Mr. Rubin had a grist mill in Rhinebeck in partnership with my grandfather, John Frederick Schultz. Now, they operated it at that time, but at that same time, this ledger from 1805 notes that my grandfather, John, was also a captain on the sloop called the Friendship on the Hudson River. He was a hired captain. He didn't own the boat. But between that time and up until 1810, he operated both businesses and amassed enough money that he was able to buy 220 acres right here in what is now Schultzville. Now you might ask, why would he choose Schultzville? Why would he choose that particular parcel? Well, Grandfather John always wanted to have his own grist mill. And this is the grist mill that Grandfather John built in 1810. It was a large, as you can see, 2.5-story grist mill. And the very unusual thing about this is it did not have just one set of stones, grindstones. It had 4 sets of grindstones. Now you can imagine to power 4 sets of grindstones, you must have a pretty good stream. And running right through those 220 acres was the Little Wappingers Creek. And that's what powered his grist mill. This is another image of the grist mill, but you can see, once I get my pointer, you can see the bridge going over the Little Wappingers Creek. Now, in fact, there were 2 bridges there. If you look at the map, oops, excuse me 1 minute. If you look at the map of Schultzville, it's alive. If you look at the map of Schultzville, you're looking You're looking at Fiddler's Bridge Road here, and here is the general store here, and here's the Triangle Park that is still here in Schultzville. It was there at that time. This is 1876. So if you went down from the store down past the Schultz house to the creek, you would see the grist mill. This is a blow-up of that, where you can see the grist mill, you can see the large pond, and when Grandfather John first built this, there was only one mill stream and one bridge. Later, my father, Daniel Schultz, built a sawmill next to the grist mill, and he had a separate mill dam for that. This is the large mill dam that fed the grist mill, and this is the small dam that fed the sawmill. And if you look in the back of the picture, near the back, you can see this building here, and we'll cover that in a minute, and that was my grandfather's original house, built in 1807. This is the sawmill that my father Daniel built. Now, we're very fortunate. We just acquired this, the Historical Society, Mr. Marshall tells me, just acquired this image from Richard Stickle, who is a Schultz descendant, and he's here tonight. And we welcome Richard, and we thank him very much for the image. When the sawmill, you could see that the sawmill was not in operation in that picture, but there was still a need for a sawmill. And this enterprising young man who was a Schultzville resident, his name is Ezra Wager, he owned and operated the steam-driven sawmill. Ezra is buried next door in the cemetery here in Schultzville. If you go back to this map of 1876, you note that instead of going straight along the road as Fiddler's Bridge does today, it actually took a bend and wound up in front of the miller's house. The miller at that time was Mr. Coons. This is that house today, the miller's house, and the current owner is in the process of restoring the home, but that is a very historical home. If you go a few hundred yards past the bridge, you come to the residence that is a farm, and it's probably built about the 1880s, but it's part of Schultzville. This is the original house that my grandfather built in 1807. This house stands there today. And in fact, the house looked very similar around the 1950s when this photo was taken. And you can see that the extension is still there. It's hidden, but the lean-to roof is still here. And if you look at the house today, you can see that the only thing that's been added are the eyebrow windows. So don't you know, this has been a very well cared for house, and Welser is one of the oldest houses in town, and certainly the oldest in Schultzville. And there's that lean-to roof that is still there today. This is a very important photograph, which we acquired recently. I like to call it Main Street, downtown Schultzville. And what you can see here on the left is the original store with a full width porch. You can see the corner house, and Center Road runs along here behind that house. You can see the Blacksmith Shop, which is still there today. We'll come back to that. You see a barn, which is no longer there, and you see the Schultzville Schoolhouse, which was built around 1850. So this is a pretty important photograph because it shows so much of what has not changed in 150 years. Around 1915, Benjamin Bradley owned this store, and this is his residence here. He did groceries, dry goods, and general merchandise. He actually had a telephone back at that time. And although it looks like the house is attached to the store, you can see that there's, in this photograph, when Melvin Sweet owned this store, there's a 5-foot separation. And that was critical and unfortunately, very unfortunate, because when the store burned in 1930, it took the house with it. And that house obviously is no longer there. It's been replaced by a small cabin owned by the present store owner. The store was rebuilt in 1930, immediately after the fire, and it looks like this, and the shed roof over here is still there today. And at this time, they were selling Gulf gas. So don't you know, it was a business that was revived immediately, and although it lost its full-width porch. In 1954, Foster Lake owned this store, And don't you know, he had the Mobile Gas as his gasoline brand. And you can see the shed roof. And we still have the smaller roof. Well, around 1990, the store actually was bought by Jim Hosey, and he did a major renovation on it, and it looks like this today. Jim added a full-width porch to it, and then in 1994, 20 years ago, Linda and Gary Stokes bought the store and the business, and they have done a wonderful job of making it a centerpiece for the hamlet and the town. If you look at the original store and the corner store, you'll see that there's a porch on this side and this side, and there's actually a porch on the other side. So that if you take a closer look, you can see some of the gingerbread on the porch that used to be there. And this is what the house looks like today. The porch is gone except for a little front overhang and a side porch. But it's in very good condition, but this is a very historic house. Going back to our main street of downtown Schultzville, and we look at the Blacksmith Shop, in the 1940s, Carlton Husted was the owner of the building, and he ran a car repair shop, and it was called the Schultzville Garage, and did very well for a number of years, now owned by Russ Tompkins. Behind that is the home of Leslie and Theron Tompkins. Now, we believe that this was a mail-order house, and the way this worked is you would get a Sears catalog, pick out the house you like, and they would ship it by railroad in pieces, but the pieces were all numbered so that you could put the house together yourself or with the aid of friends. Directly across the street on 9 Partners is the Schoolhouse. This photo was taken in 1973 before it was modified by a later owner. Now, don't you know, it's a one-room schoolhouse. It was built in 1850. It still exists intact. And as you can see, there was a bell tower. Now, there was a bell hanging up there, and some of you know where that bell is today, and some of you don't. So let me tell you where the bell is. It's right there. And it was donated to the town by Captain James Tripp, who had a Hudson River sloop and married one of the 2 Schultz girls. And the Schultzes donated the land and money for the school, and then Captain Tripp donated the bell after the Enterprise was taken out of service. This is an early photo about 1905 of a gathering in front of the schoolhouse. And I assume these are the students and their parents at that time. It was obviously a very formal occasion, and if you look more closely, they wore their very best, and the women's variety of hats was, well, just something to behold. And don't you know, my favorite really is this one. My goodness, it looks like 2 birds ready to take off. A great photo. This is the way the house looks today. It has the front extension, but the original schoolhouse is still intact behind the extension. Now, if you were to go behind the schoolhouse up the hill and look down on the town, on the hamlet, you would see a site like this, and this building is currently the residence of Lynn and Russ Tompkins. And the building here was the original wagon shop. And the wagon shop served a very important purpose. If you looked at the same scene standing at the same spot when the leaves were not on the trees, you got a little bit better picture of what was down there. This is the corner house, this is the store, and this is my grandfather John's house. Now, this wagon shop, as I said, it was important because everybody drove wagons at the time. I'd like to show you the wagon of one Schultzville couple. Her name is Henrietta, and she said, whoops. Yes, there was one other comment to be made on the blacksmith shop. Next time you go past it, take a look at this roof. This was 1907 when this was taken. This shed roof is still there. That shed roof was used as access to bring wagons up that roof and into the barn door that was a double barn that swung open. So they could work on the wagons where they could store the wagons out of season, and that's still there. But getting back to Henrietta's carriage. This is Henrietta and her sister with their family horse Dobbin, and they were very, very proud of this carriage. And there's a story to be told. Henrietta married Hubert. As I said, they were a Schultzville couple, and they were out riding in their carriage one day, coming from Pleasant Plains along Fiddler's Ridge Road, trying to get home to the farm in Schultzville. Well, unfortunately, old Dobbin picked up a stone and started limping. In fact, it got so bad that old Hubert had to get off the wagon and unhitch old Dobbin. And now he's faced with, well, how am I going to get this wagon home? Unfortunately, Hubert had just injured his leg in an accident on the farm, wasn't able to walk too well. So he was really bewildered. How am I going to get this carriage home? He came up with a difficult but effective decision. Now, Henrietta wasn't too happy about this. And when she got home, she said, Hubert, old Dobbin is not going to keep us going here too long. I saw something I would really like to have, and Hubert, we're going to buy it. We're going to go to Poughkeepsie. Now, Hubert was a pretty wise man. He knew what battles he could win and what he couldn't win. So he replied with those two words that have settled very many marital discord. He said, yes, dear. So they went to Poughkeepsie, and this is what they came home with. Henrietta was really pleased. That is for a few months, because this was the spring. And in the spring, the unpaved roads get kind of muddy. And she realized after a while this wasn't too practical as much as she enjoyed the bicycle. So she said, Hubert, this isn't going to work. You know what the Schultzes and the Travers just bought. We need to get one of those too. Poor Hubert. He had been saving his money for one of these newfangled, up-to-date, gasoline-powered, labor-saving tractors to make his farm work more easier and put old Dobbin out to pasture. But he was a wise man, and he said, yes, dear. And this is what they came home with. And I have to tell you that Hubert and Henrietta were a happy couple in Schultzville ever since. When I was 23, as I said, I passed away. Just before that, when I was in serious illness and I was told I didn't have long to live, I began to think about what I could do for my community that would reside after I left. And I thought of my Masonic brothers. We had been meeting in Lafayetteville, which is a distance from here, for several years. So I approached the Brotherhood and I said, if I bequest the money and the land to build a Masonic Hall here in Schultzville, would you do it? And they said yes. And this is the original Masonic Hall that was built in 1865, that until recently was in the center of Schultzville by the corner. It's a handsome building, and the membership grew and grew and grew until the late 1950s. It was so large they put an addition on the back and on the side, which included a kitchen. And they were doing very well for many years. Unfortunately, the membership dwindled till they were down to about 5 or 6 members. They were paying taxes, could no longer afford the building, and offered to the Clinton Historical Society, who took it and with the help of many area and Clinton residents worked on to restore it. This is what it looked like when they first got it. It was in need of a lot of repair, but as I said, with the help of many folks, this is the jewel that it became after restoration, both inside and outside. And as you know, this hall now stands next door as part of the Clinton Historical Center. I was thinking at that time that I was very, very ill. What else could I do for the community? And I realized we had no church. And I approached 2 local pastors in the area. And again, I offered, if I offer the land and the money to build a church, would you do so? They said yes, so I offered $3,000 and the land in my will to go to build the Clinton Alliance Church, which was called the Christian Church in Schultzville. It's a handsome building, has a full-width porch, large windows to make it very light and breezy. This is another view of it, taken a few years later. And the church did very, very well. It looks like this today with a shortened porch with a banister around there, but again, it's been restored since this picture was taken and is in excellent condition. At the time that they built the church, they also built the parsonage for the parson and his wife, and that also exists today, pretty much intact the way it is today. They also built a church hall years later. This is taken about 1915, and the only change to this building is that there's been a lean-to addition put onto the south side. These lovely ladies were one of the groups that used the church. This is the Schultzville Campfire Girls, and aren't they lovely? I'm going to end our little tour of the hamlet of Schultzville by coming here to the town hall. The town hall was built in 1924 as a gift from John Lyon, who was a local resident. Now, he also was ill, and this came by way of bequest to the town. But just before he died, he was pretty sure he wanted this to be in the central part of town because there was a controversy. Where should the Clinton Town Hall be? Hibernia, Clinton Corners, where? John persevered, and he said it has to be in the geographical center of the town, and that's why it's here today. And later on, the addition for the Justice Court was built, as was in 1976 the library. So the town hall complex, or the historical buildings next door, the 1850s Spooky Hollow Schoolhouse and the 1865 Masonic Hall, have made this a real treasure. I think we're the envy of many other towns for what we have here. And we thank all the people who have put their time to make this happen. Well, that's pretty much my pitch, and Mr. Marshall is going to come up here and talk to you about the history of the house that my father built in 1858, right here in Schultzville. Before he does that, Cynthia Cook is going to talk to you about a few things. I'm going to leave you with one request. It gets kind of lonely hanging up there behind the master's chair. And next time you come by the Masonic Hall, go up to the second floor, look at my portrait, wave and say, "Hi, Gus." Thank you. Hi, I'm Craig Marshall, and I'm the town historian as well as the vice president of the Clinton Historical Society. Hope you enjoyed Gus's presentation. I have to tell you, I really admire the man. Think about it, 23 years old, you're being told you don't have long to live, and you think about your community and his lasting legacy of the Masonic Hall and the church. I mean, it's really very impressive to have people like that as our town residents. I'd like to talk to you about the Daniel Schultz house and the architectural features in it. It is featured in our new book that Cynthia talked about. It was built in 1856, and we know that because this is Daniel's ledger, his weekly ledger that day by day he made an entry of how much he paid the carpenters, the painters, and the stonemasons. In fact, I know when to the day when the wings were added onto the house, he paid them $1 a day, which was the going rate at the time. And that was a long day. He was a wealthy man. He inherited the business from his father, John Frederick. So he had the grist mill. He built the sawmill, operated for many years. He was also owner of the store. And in fact, he was the postmaster for the store because that's where the post office was at the time. He owned several properties here in town. And quite frankly, he was actually the local banker, so to speak. He would loan money to the local residents. And there's one story that says that at the time of his death in 1858, he had $20,000 outstanding. Now consider that a property with a lot of acreage could be bought for $1,000. That's 20 properties. So in today's prices, that could add up 20 properties. So he was a man of wealth, and he married a young lady named Louisa Conger. And I don't think to impress her, but really to impress other folks in the area, including those in Poughkeepsie who might come by. This is the house he built. He really spared no expense. My wife Mary and I own this house. We moved to Schultzville in 1973 to buy this home. And it was obviously a large home. It's basically a 40 by 40 box with a 20 by 20 extension on the back. The first floor ceilings are 9 foot, and the second floor 10 foot. And a lot of gingerbread, as folks call it. When he died, and unfortunately he only lived in the house 2 years before he died in 1858, he left his young wife Louisa and 2 daughters. Gus was living elsewhere. This is a later picture of Susan Schultz, and she married Timothy Palmer. Now Timothy was a businessman, traveled to New York City a lot, but he was also, they both resided in Grandfather John's house here in Schultzville. And he was also at one time the postmaster, and he's most noted because he actually had an invention for a postal cancellation machine, which made him kind of different from the farmers that are around here. Susan's sister Ida looks like this in later years, and she married James Tripp, as I mentioned before. They donated the Bell. He was the sloop captain of the Enterprise, and they also lived in the area. When we bought the house, it was a summer lodge. In fact, it was a Hungarian cuisine type summer lodge. It was called Star Lodge. The owner and his wife had a business in Queens, New York, a bakery called the Star Bakery. And in summers, they would come up here to open up the lodge for their clientele from the Queens. So they all spoke Hungarian. They ate Hungarian meals. And it was a very successful business. They advertised the local sites, such as Long Pond and Silver Lake for fishing and rowboating, which occurred at that time. Has a pool, and this is the dining room. And when we bought the place, John, the owner's name was John. His wife, Mary, had just died 2 years previously, and he decided to give up the business. That's why he was selling the business. But the day we moved in, it could have been a running business. The tables were set, the beds were made, and there was accommodations with the outbuildings for 75 people. So nothing that we wanted to get into. We had our hands full because, you'll see in a minute, there was a lot to do. If you wanted to stay here at the lodge, you could see that the price was $78 per person per week, and your kids were even less. It was a very popular, they typically had about 40 people at any given week. This was 1971, and this was the last year that it was open before we purchased the home. Now when you look at the home, you can see that there's a lot of windows. Louisa and Daniel wanted a bright house, and they certainly got a bright house. But what that meant to Mary and I was that we had to install ourselves 52 storm windows, which was a challenge. We did it ourselves. The other thing that was notable is that this has been a rooming house, a summer rooming house, since the 1920s. So for 50 years until we bought it, there was no heating system. So here we are in Dutchess County with no heating system. So we learned how to sweat copper pipe, and we installed a boiler ourselves, and we're doing very well. Fortunately, this was before our kids arrived. And we've had fun with the house. Now, one of the most notable features about this house, as noted by a local architectural historian, is the front entrance. If you look at the front porch in front of the front steps, you have this archway from the porch, and as you step onto the deck, you can see this archway here, and there's some gingerbread here. You can't see it too clearly, but these are raised panel gingerbread. And if you go a little bit farther into the alcove, you can see that there's more gingerbread on the side, gingerbread up here, and it's even paneling here, moldings here. It's a pretty impressive entry, and this is where the visitors would come. So it's pretty clear that Daniel wanted to impress his visitors. This is some more close-up of the gingerbread. He didn't know when to stop. If you look at the front door from the inside, he installed colored glass. And in fact, if you remember the picture of the home from the outside on the third floor, there's two diagonal windows, they're not octagon, hexagon. They're hexagon windows, and they're on each of the four sides, and they have the same colored glass. So it's a very pleasant effect when the sun shines through. Oh, there they are. Those are on each of the sides. Now, the other feature about this particular house was the siding. Was the overhang buttresses. If you take a closer look, this is the roof overhang in the same along the front porch also has roof supports. They are all in the shape Okay. Thank you for bearing with me. They're all in the shape of the letter S, and Mary and I truly believe that they stand for Schultz. Again, he was not a vain man, I guess some would say, but it seems to prove otherwise. The other feature of Daniel's house when he built it was he wanted a siding that was very different than other people's house siding. What you're looking at are actually 8-inch wide cedar siding, 1-inch thick, tongue and grooved. But if you take a closer look, you can see that they've been chamfered to look like blocks. So it looks like a block house, but it's actually 1-inch cedar. And if you see the lintels up on here, they even have some ginger red below them. It just goes on and on. He spared no expense. In fact, I have to tell you this is kind of amusing. Where are we? Daniel was so impressed with this siding that he used it for his outhouse. In fact, the outhouse is lath and plaster on the inside. So my thinking is, not only did he want to impress his visitors when they were inside the house on social, but when they had to go outside for other things, they were still impressed. This is one of the interior moldings around the interior doors. This is the second one. He couldn't make up his mind which design he liked. So he came up with 4 of them. That's the second one. This is the third one with a diamond. And this is the fourth one. And the distance, here. The distance from the top of the molding to, we'll keep going, is 12 inches. It's a pretty high molding. Imagine trying to replace that today. Downstairs in the center hall, where the stairs leading to the second floor, what appears to be tiger maple is actually pine that has been fall painted with graining, which was very popular at the time. But it's a very, very pleasant effect. Upstairs in the master bedroom, which measures 15 by 40, it's the full depth of the house, he installed pocket doors between the two halves, sliding pocket doors, big and heavy. And the molding here is 16 inches from bottom to top. Just amazing. He also installed plaster cornice work, which is popular on the more expensive houses. And this is still in excellent shape after 150 years. The marble mantles are not at every chimney. There's 4 chimneys in the house. In case you don't know, typically marble front fireplaces, or fire fronts, do not have fireplaces here. Instead, they use parlor stoves. And the way this worked is the hired help would go up to the barn in the fall, bring down the parlor stove, and above this mirror you would see a 6-inch porthole. So they would hook up the parlor stove in front of the marble, run the stovepipes through the porthole, heat the home for the winter, and then in the spring the process would reverse. Of the 4 chimneys, we do have 1 working fireplace in the home. In the late 40s and early 50s, again, this was a rooming house, as you recall. It was easy and fairly inexpensive to find golden oak furniture, and pretty cheap because it was out of fashion. People didn't know what to do with it. So you could pick it up pretty cheap. And John bought a lot of oak furniture, and that was all went with the house. Basically, he handed us the key. Everything was left behind. And this was one of the cherry dressers, armoires that remained behind. So we actually have one marble top that has the name Schultz written on the back of it. And I believe it's around the Civil War era. That's pretty much the tour of the house. What I'd like to talk about are some of the artifacts we have in Schultzville that you may or may not be aware of. You now are aware of the school bell as an artifact. This is one of the original grindstones from the Grist Mill here in Schultzville. And the way this came about was Bill Smith, who lives in Clinton Hollow, in the late 50s when they were building the Skill Deck Bridge. He was operating the backhoe down by the stream, getting ready for the foundations. He hit something, and this is what he pulled up. And if you look closely, you can see still the marks from the grindstone. And the process was every time it was needed, there was a traveling person, in fact it was one of his uncles, one of his ancestors, was in the business of dressing grindstones for the different mill owners. I was walking through our woods one time and stumbled upon Gus's headstone, and you can imagine what went through my mind as to what's under the headstone. Well, as it turns out, I learned later, by the way, I found Daniel's headstone nearby as well on our property. Turns out in 1921, the last remaining member of the family had all the graves removed from Schultzville into Rhinebeck, and they discarded the headstones into the woods and made new ones for the Rhinebeck plots. If you look real close, and I don't know if it's visible, but it says that Gus died at 23 years and 10 months. But the other notable thing is, if you look really close, is that his last name ended in ZS. And if you look at all the Schultz headstones and all the Schultz ledgers, they all end in ZS. So here's a question. For 200 years, have we been spelling Schultzville wrong? This is an interesting school desk because it's the last surviving school desk of any of the one-room schoolhouses in our town. It is owned by Sandra and Lowell Lamb, who owned the schoolhouse. So this original desk came from the Schultzville Schoolhouse, is now back in the Schultzville Schoolhouse with Sandra and Lowell. They did a beautiful job of restoring it. We also have, as I mentioned, as artifacts, we have about 10 volumes of the John and Daniel Schultz, the sawmill and the grist mill, and there may even been a plaster mill at some time. These were found in my barn, which dates from 1856, by my son one day. He came running down and said, "Dad, look what I found." I was thrilled, to say the least. So we have one ledger actually shows 500 accounts around the 1850 time frame. So it was a very popular destination. You may or may not know that we had a much larger population in the 1850s, and then it declined substantially in around the late 1800s. I would like to thank the different people who gave us the images for Gus's presentation as well as my own. These are the folks that I've mentioned. I'd like to thank Herbert Sweet and his wife Barbara for doing the video today. Our plan is to have the video and possibly put it on YouTube. Thank you. YouTube. And if we do that, we'll let you know. I would like to close with a question which has occurred to me. Why does Schultzville continue to be so thriving and successful as a hamlet and community after 200 years? Now remember, like many, many hamlets that started with a mill in Clinton, in Dutchess County, in New York State, in fact in the Northeast, many of these hamlets are either non-existent anymore or just shells of the former self. But here we are in Schultzville and we are thriving. Why is that? Well, you may have your own answers. I'd like to give you my answer, which consists of 4 parts. The first is, we've been blessed with a lot of great leaders in our community. I think about John Lyons, who bequeathed the money to build this building that we're sitting in right here tonight, the beginning of the town hall complex. And then in 1988, Betty Davis donated money to build the court addition on the rear of this structure. And then the historical center with the 1850 Spooky Hollow Schoolhouse and the 1865 Masonic Hall brought in to create a historical center, very well utilized. These are the new town offices, but the second floor of that Masonic Hall is still intact. If you haven't seen the barrel ceiling, which is made of the same kind of wood, but it's a rounded ceiling, it's something you really need to see. And the very interesting thing is, besides still being open for community use, the Masons, the Warren Masons, are still meeting at that temple as they did for the last 150 years. So that's worked out very well for everybody concerned. The second is the Clinton Community Library, which was built here as an addition in 1976, where a lot of local residents decided that we really needed something for the kids and for the adults as well. And the library was built. And that has attracted a lot of youth and families to our hamlet of Schultzville. Very important addition. You think about the Schultzville store, and who has not been in the Schultzville store? It's like we have our own Cheers here. You go in and people know your name. You always get a friendly greeting. And Jim Hosey started that, and Linda and Gary Stokes have done a wonderful job of enhancing the store and keeping it going and making it the jewel that it is. And that has certainly been an addition to our hamlet that's benefited everybody. And last is the church. When Mary and I came here in 1973, the church was on pretty shaky ground. It was going through a series of pastors until God smiled us, and in 1981, he sent Tom Hartley as a new pastor and his wife Carol. And for the past 34 years, that church has grown, the congregation has grown and grown, and they have a focus on youth. You've seen the new youth center that they built recently. And the outlook for that church is very, very positive indeed. So in my mind, why are we still such a vibrant hamlet? These are just some of the reasons, in my mind, the major reasons. We're just very fortunate in the town of Clinton, as well as the hamlet of Schultzville. We've had so many community people who are so concerned with the environment, our scenic roads, our rural setting. It's just been a joy for Mary and I to be residents here. We feel really blessed, and I think a lot of us share that as well. I want to thank you for coming, and as town historian, I would be remiss if I didn't put an ad in here. Many of these images were on loan and copies of local residents, and we'd like to have if you have any or know of any, we'd like to be able to copy them. That photo that you saw of the sawmill was given to us just within the last month by Richard, and Richard is here tonight, and I thank Richard Stickle and thank him for the loan and welcome him here. He is a Schultz descendant, so that works. So I would like you to enjoy the refreshments. I thank the library for co-sponsoring this. And the table in the back has some of the artifacts and old pictures that may or may not have been part of this presentation. It's getting a little bit late, so I'll handle questions off to the side, and would like to thank you very much for coming. You've been a great audience. Thank you.